Imagine this carefully. Not dramatically, not like a movie. Just carefully. You wake up one morning, stand beside your bed, and your shadow is already there, stretched across the floor, exactly where it should be. It has always been there, since the first time you learned what light was, what absence was, what darkness meant when it clung to your feet. You don't think about it. No one ever does. Shadows are background noise to existence. They are proof that light exists. Nothing more. They follow rules, so basic we stop noticing them. They move when we move. They disappear when light disappears. They never act first, until the day one of them does. The earliest reports were embarrassing. That's the word people used later. Embarrassing stories, awkward stories, stories people laughed off before finishing the sentence. A woman in Lisbon said her shadow lagged behind her for half a second while she turned a corner. A teenager in Seoul swore his shadow raised his hand after he dropped his phone, not at the same time, but just slightly later, as if deciding to copy him instead of being forced to. In Toronto, a man filed a maintenance complaint claiming the lights in his office were faulty because his shadow kept leaning in directions he would see. Every single case had something in common. There was no fear yet, just confusion, mild discomfort, the kind you explain away because the alternative sounds insane. Optical illusion, fatigue, stress, bad lighting. Doctors blamed exhaustion. Physicists blamed angles. Psychologists blamed the human brain's tendency to seek patterns where none exist. And for a while, a very short while, those explanations worked because the shadows didn't do anything wrong. Not yet. The first undeniable shift wasn't dramatic. There was no scream, no collapse, no sudden violence. It was a delay. People began describing the same sensation, using almost identical language, despite living in different countries, speaking different languages. It felt like my shadow hesitated, not stopped, not froze, hesitated. A woman walking her dog noticed her shadow took an extra step after she stopped. A bus driver saw his shadow remain seated for a fraction of a second after he stood. A child in a school hallway laughed because her shadow tripped, even though she hadn't. These moments were tiny, blink and miss it moments, but they planted something far more dangerous than fear: doubt. Because hesitation implies choice, and shadows were never supposed to choose. Human curiosity is predictable. Once enough people experienced the same strange inconsistency, they began testing it quietly, almost playfully, as if afraid to admit what they were really doing. They waved their arms slowly. They stopped mid-step. They turned their heads sharply, watching the floor or the wall instead of their reflection. At first, shadows still followed. Mostly, but sometimes. Sometimes, they didn't. A man in Buenos Aires described lifting his hand and holding it there, watching his shadow mirror the motion perfectly, until he lowered his arm and the shadow didn't tee. It stayed raised, just for a moment. Then it snapped back into place, as if embarrassed. He laughed, nervously, alone in his apartment. He did not laugh the second time. The change from off to wrong happened quietly. Keys went missing, only to be found directly beneath the owner's feet. Drinks tipped over without explanation. People tripped over nothing and swore they felt pressure around their ankles. At first, these were blamed on clumsiness until patterns emerged. Shadows began interfering in ways that felt intentional, but trivial enough to deny. A woman would reach for her phone and knock it over. except she was certain her hand never touched it. A man would feel something tug at his coat as he stood up, only to turn and see no one behind him. Children complained their shadows were being annoying, refusing to line up properly during games. Refusing. That word started appearing more often. Not lagging, not glitching. Refusing. There is a reason humanity didn't panic immediately. Shadows had no faces, no voices, no physical mass. They didn't bleed. They didn't attack. Not yet. They didn't leave evidence. And perhaps, most importantly, they belong to us. How do you accuse something that has followed you your entire life? Something that exists only because you exist. To admit something was wrong with shadows meant admitting something might be wrong with ourselves. So people waited. Governments waited. Scientists waited. Media outlets waited until the first recorded incident that could not be dismissed. It happened in a public stairwell in Berlin. The footage still exists. A security camera captured a woman descending concrete steps in an underground parking structure. The lighting was harsh, fluorescent. Her shadow stretched sharply along the wall beside her, elongated and crisp. Halfway down, she stopped. She later said she felt watched, not by another person, but by something attached to her. She took one step back. Her shadow took 2 steps forward. There is a moment frozen now in countless paused frames, where the woman is standing still, and her shadow is not aligned with her body at all. It leans toward her. She runs. Her shadow does not chase her. It blocks her. The footage ends when she falls. She survived physically. But when questioned, she refused to walk under artificial lighting again. She said something that made investigators uncomfortable. It wasn't angry. It was amused. After Berlin, the tone shifted. Reports poured in faster than they could be cataloged, and something new appeared in the descriptions. Something chilling. Character, shadows weren't just acting independently. They were acting differently. Some were playful, some disruptive, some cruel. A shy, introverted man described his shadow as loud, exaggerated in its movements, mocking him in public by gesturing wildly when he stood still. A kind school teacher said her shadow kicked a chair out from under a student. Once, then never again, as if satisfied. Even more disturbing were the opposites. Aggressive people with eerily calm shadows. Violent offenders whose shadows stayed perfectly still, even when they paced. Abusive individuals whose shadows appeared smaller than expected. Almost withdrawn. It was as if the darkness was balancing something or revealing it. Privately, researchers began discussing an idea they would not publish. That shadows were not random, that they were not new, that they were late. The theory suggested shadows had always been connected to us, not as reflections, but as containers, places where unused impulses, suppressed thoughts, and unrealized desires when we learn to behave, not evil, unexpressed. And now, for reasons still unknown, those containers were leaking. Another pattern emerged. Every documented case of a shadow's first major act could be traced back to a moment of emotional intensity. Grief, rage, humiliation, fear. A man lost his wife and noticed his shadow began lingering near her empty chair. A teenager bullied at school said his shadow pushed another boy down the stairs, and he swore he didn't want it to happen, even as relief washed over him. The most chilling cases involved people who experienced nothing at all. No trauma, no breakdown, no visible trigger. Their shadows still changed, which raised a terrifying question. What if emotional control was never the cause, only the lack? Sleep became difficult. Not because shadows attacked in the dark, they couldn't, but because people realized something far worse. Darkness. Didn't he remove shadows? It freed them. With no light source, shadows no longer had to mimic anything. They no longer needed to stay flat or obedient. People reported shapes shifting in rooms where the lights were off, movement where there should have been none. And for the first time in human history, millions of people slept with every light on, not out of fear of what lurked in the dark, but out of fear of what stood closest to them in the light. The phrase appeared in forums, then in interviews, then in official transcripts. It made the first move. Not a push, not an attack. A step. Someone stood still, and their shadow moved. Not away, not randomly, towards something it wanted. No one could explain why that moment mattered so much, but everyone who saw it said the same thing. That was when it stopped being a phenomenon and became a presence. For centuries, humanity argued about the soul, whether it existed, where it lived, what part of us it belonged to. No one ever suggested it might be standing on the floor beside us. Before the word shadow became dangerous to say out loud, researchers used a softer term: asynchronous projection behavior. It sounded clinical, safe, temporary. A way to pretend this was still a lighting problem. But language has a way of breaking when reality refuses to cooperate, because these projections were no longer just out of sync. They were expressive. The shift became undeniable during a controlled study in Stockholm. 30 volunteers, identical lighting. No mirrors, no windows. Every movement recorded. For the first hour, nothing happened. For the second, subtle delays appeared, the same hesitation already documented worldwide. Then, one volunteer laughed. It wasn't nervous laughter. It wasn't fear. It was surprise. Her shadow had shrugged. Not a misalignment. Not a blur. A shrug. When asked why she laughed, she said something that ended the session early. It looks like it doesn't care. That was the moment scientists stopped talking about errors and started talking about intent. Once researchers stopped asking if shadows were behaving independently, a more unsettling pattern emerged. They weren't acting arbitrarily. They were acting consistently. Each shadow exhibited traits that remained stable over time. Preferences, habits, even moods. Some paced when their owners were some mimicked exaggerated movements, as if mocking. Others withdrew completely, clinging close to the feet like frightened animals. And most disturbing of all, they didn't match their hosts. This phenomenon became known as the inversion. Shadows frequently displayed traits their owners consciously rejected. A timid accountant whose shadow spread wide, posturing aggressively. A charismatic performer whose shadow shrank, folding inward, avoiding attention. A calm, disciplined doctor whose shadow kicked a trash bin during an argument, something he later admitted he had wanted to do but never would. The shadows weren't opposites. They were unexpressed. Psychologists began revisiting theories long dismissed as abstract philosophy. The idea of the shadow self, the suppressed ID, the parts of the psyche shaped out of us by rules, shame, and survival. Except now, those parts had outlines, and they were visible. Children adapted faster than adults, they always do, while adults debated ethics and science. Children named their shadows. They talked to them. They complained about them. One child described her shadow as bossy. Another said his shadow gets bored easily. Teachers reported students arguing with the floor during class. At first, this was dismissed as imagination. until children began predicting their shadow's behavior correctly. "Don't sit there," one boy warned a teacher. "Mine doesn't like it when people sit there." Moments later, the chair slid back. Just enough. In Osaka, a woman noticed something odd while waiting for a train. Her shadow leaned toward the edge of the platform. Every time she moved away, it stretched. She stepped back. It followed. She tested it repeatedly, heart racing. Her shadow preferred the edge. Later analysis of the footage revealed something chilling. The shadow's movements were smoother when closer to the drop, as if more comfortable there. When questioned, the woman admitted something she had never told anyone. She had struggled with intrusive thoughts for years, thoughts she never acted on, thoughts she hated herself for having. Her shadow didn't hate them, it embraced them. As personalities solidified, conflict became inevitable. People began describing resistance. A man tried to leave his apartment and felt an inexplicable pull backward. His shadow leaned toward the doorframe, as if bracing itself. A woman reached for a knife to cook dinner and froze. Her shadow's arm was raised defensively, blocking the motion. These moments didn't feel violent. They felt argumentative, as if two intentions were competing for the same body. The question no one wanted to ask became unavoidable. Who was really in control before? Mirrors were supposed to help. They didn't. When people watched their shadows directly, they behaved almost perfectly. But reflections revealed something subtle. Micro-expressions, tiny distortions that didn't align with facial movement, a smirk where no smile existed, tension where calm should be. Shadows knew when they were being watched, and they cared. Another pattern emerged that terrified therapists. Shadows responded to emotional states faster than their hosts. Fear appeared in shadows before people consciously felt it. Anger flared in darkness, seconds before heart rates spiked. Grief lingered in shadows long after tears stopped. It suggested something horrifying, that shadows weren't reacting to emotion. They were detecting it at its source. Before language, before logic, before denial. The case was minor. That's what made it unforgettable. A woman stood up from a bench in a public park. Her shadow stayed seated. People laughed. She laughed too, until it didn't move when she walked away. It stretched, distorted, anchored to the bench like it belonged there. When it finally followed, it moved reluctantly, like a child being dragged from a place they didn't want to leave. Later, she admitted she had been sitting there longer than planned, avoiding going home. Her shadow wasn't confused. It disagreed. As personalities sharpened, debates erupted. Were shadows separate beings, or fragments of the self-given form? If your shadow acted cruelly, was it your fault? If it protected you, was it heroism or instinct? Courts refused to hear cases involving shadow interference. Employers struggled to assign blame. Relationships fractured under a new strain. Intent ambiguity. "I didn't mean to," people said, and for the first time, that might have been true. The most disturbing development came quietly. Shadows began reacting to past events. Places where people had experienced trauma-triggered visible responses, flinching, shrinking, or aggressive expansion. Shadows avoided certain rooms, certain streets, certain people they remembered, even when their hosts had learned to forget. One man watched his shadow recoil from a doorway he hadn't thought about in years. He remembered why only after. By the end of the second year, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Shadows were not evolving randomly. They were maturing, learning boundaries, testing limits, refining behavior like something newly conscious, figuring out what it could get away with. And beneath every scientific paper, every calm interview, every forced reassurance, one unspoken fear lurked. If shadows were becoming themselves, what would they eventually want? The world didn't end when shadows developed personalities. That was the most unsettling part. Cities didn't burn. Governments didn't fall overnight. There was no single moment of collapse. Instead, life adjusted. And in that adjustment, something fragile began to crack. You don't argue with your shadow in public. People learned this quickly. Arguments drew attention. Attention led to questions. Questions led to videos. Videos led to consequences no one fully understood yet. So disagreements became subtle. A hesitation before stepping forward. A pause when reaching for a door. A careful repositioning of the body to keep the shadow aligned. People began moving differently. Slower, more deliberate, as if constantly negotiating. Waking up was the hardest part of the day. Before coffee, before clarity. People describe the same ritual. Sitting on the edge of the bed, watching the floor, waiting to see what their shadow would do first. Some shadows stretched lazily, some stayed still, as if refusing to acknowledge the day. Others pressed close, coiled tightly at the feet, tense with anticipation. These first moments set the tone. If your shadow resisted, the day would be difficult. If it cooperated, you felt relief and a strange gratitude. No one liked admitting that. Relationships changed in quiet, devastating ways. People began watching each other's shadows more than faces. In conversations, eyes dropped instinctively, checking alignment, movement, intent. Dates ended early when shadows lingered too close or mimicked gestures a little too eagerly. Parents watched their children's shadows for signs of aggression. Teachers arranged desks based on shadow behavior. Employers noted projection, instability in performance reviews. Trust became visual, and shadows told, truth's mouths didn't. Physical closeness became complicated. Shadows touched before people did. They overlapped, intertwined, pulled away. Couples described moments of hesitation where their bodies leaned in, but their shadows recoiled or worse, reached eagerly when they themselves felt uncertain. Consent became layered, not just between people, but between the things attached to them. Breakups happened over shadows that wouldn't stop intruding. Marriages strained under the weight of unseen conflict playing out on walls and floors. It felt like there were 4 of us, one woman said, and 2 of them hated each other. Cities changed. Lighting was redesigned to minimize shadow distortion. Streets were brighter, flatter, harsher. Buildings avoided dramatic angles. Public spaces favored diffuse light, reducing sharp silhouettes. Fashion followed. Matte fabrics, light-absorbing textures, clothing designed to break outlines. People dressed to control their shadows. It didn't always work. Unspoken rules emerged. You don't step on another person's shadow. You don't block someone's light source. You don't comment on shadow behavior unless invited. Violating these norms was seen as deeply personal, an intrusion into something intimate and unstable. Children learn these rules faster than adults. They always do. Workplace incidents rose sharply. Tools slipped. Machines jammed. Hands hesitated at critical moments. In factories and hospitals, shadows interfering with fine motor control became a serious safety concern. Surgeons demanded specialized lighting. Pilots trained in shadow suppression environments. When something went wrong, the question was always the same. Did you do it, or did your shadow? There was no way to prove either. Legal systems struggled. If a shadow knocked someone down, who was responsible? The host? The shadow? The environment that allowed it? Courts rejected early cases, citing lack of precedent. But public pressure mounted. A man was fired after his shadow repeatedly disrupted meetings. A woman lost custody of her child when her shadow displayed protective aggression towards social workers. People began hiding their shadow's behavior, which only made things worse. Some people tried the opposite approach. They reduced light, dimmed rooms, soft lamps, curtains drawn at all hours. If shadows couldn't be seen clearly, maybe they couldn't act as boldly. It was a mistake. In low light, shadows blurred, and in that blur, they became unpredictable. People reported movement without clear form, shapes that didn't match their bodies at all. Darkness didn't calm them. It liberated them. Over time, people noticed something strange. Shadows began specializing. Some were defensive, positioning themselves between their hosts and perceived threats. Others were disruptive, seeking attention through interference. A few were eerily passive, content to remain still no matter what happened. People started describing their shadows the way you describe a difficult roommate. Mine's jealous. Mine gets bored easily. Mine only acts up when I'm lying. That last one became disturbingly common. Shadows reacted to dishonesty, not lies spoken casually. The small social ones everyone tells. They responded to a man claimed he was happy in his job. His shadow slumped, dragged behind him like a weight. A woman insisted she was over a breakup. Her shadow lingered near places associated with her ex. Therapists began watching shadows during sessions. Sometimes they reacted before patients spoke. Sometimes they contradicted them entirely. If shadows expressed suppressed desires, were they wrong? If they protected people from choices they'd regret, were they guardians? And if they acted cruelly, were they simply expressing truths society forced underground? The line between illness, morality, and identity blurred. People asked a question that would have been unthinkable before. Should we be listening to them? The hardest part wasn't fear. It was exhaustion. There was no privacy anymore. No internal monologue that wasn't reflected somewhere on the floor. No moment of emotional vulnerability that didn't ripple outward. People described feeling seen in a way mirrors never achieved. Not judged. Understood. And for some, that understanding was unbearable. Whispers began circulating. Rumors of people who had tried to get rid of their shadows. Extreme lighting. Isolation chambers. Experimental therapies. Most failed. Some resulted in breakdowns far worse than before. But a few worked. And that was when the world realized it wasn't just about coexistence anymore. It was about control. The first people who tried to control shadows didn't do it out of cruelty. They did it out of desperation. A mother whose shadow kept pulling her child away from strangers. A surgeon whose shadow trembled during operations. A man who hadn't slept in weeks because his shadow wouldn't stop pacing. People weren't looking for dominance. They were looking for relief. They called themselves many things at first. Shadow guides, projection, therapists, light, alignment. Later, a simpler name stuck. Shadow whisperers. They claimed shadows weren't enemies, just misunderstood reflections of suppressed emotion. If you could communicate properly, they said, harmony was possible. Sessions were expensive, unregulated, and wildly inconsistent. Some people left feeling lighter, calmer. Their shadows softened, mimicked more gently, stayed in sync. Others left worse than before. No one could explain why. Everything changed when a video surfaced. A man stood in a brightly lit room. His shadow twitched, restless, defiant. The whisperer spoke calmly, slowly, using language that didn't quite sound like normal speech. And the shadow stopped. It didn't vanish. It knelt. The internet exploded. Whether the video was staged didn't matter. Hope is more viral than truth. Appointments booked out months in advance. Once money entered the equation, morality followed slowly. Packages appeared. Basic alignment, calming techniques, light exposure routines, behavioral conditioning, rewards, punishment via shadow isolation, full compliance, advertised only through private channels. No guarantees, no refunds. People paid anyway, because living with a hostile shadow was worse than living with uncertainty. Technology adapted faster than law. Directional lighting rigs designed to pin shadows in place. Wearable projectors creating artificial countershadows. Rooms built with overlapping light sources to fracture projection continuity. Some worked, some caused shadows to fragment, splitting into multiple, overlapping forms that behaved erratically. Those cases never made the brochures. It didn't take long. Certain shadows were desirable. Aggressive ones, deceptive ones, shadows that acted independently without much resistance. People learned that under the right conditions, shadows could be separated temporarily, detached long enough to be used, rented, traded. No one called it slavery, but everyone knew what it was. Crimes increased that left no fingerprints. Shadows slipped under doors, reached into restricted spaces, triggered sensors calibrated for physical bodies. When caught, perpetrators blamed shadow interference. Sometimes it was true, sometimes it wasn't. The line became impossible to trace. On private forums, prices varied. A docile shadow fetched little. A manipulative one sold for more. A shadow that acted with initiative, one that anticipated movement, was priceless. There were whispers of collectors, people who didn't want their own shadows anymore, people who wanted others. Eventually, denial became impossible. Governments issued advisories, then guidelines, then mandates. Shadows were classified. Type 1, passive type 2, reactive type 3, autonomous type 4. Hostile independent registration programs followed. People were asked, then required to report abnormal shadow behavior. Some complied, others went dark. Officially, they were called projection research centers. Unofficially, everyone called them cages. Bright, sterile rooms where light never moved. Subjects standing for hours. Their shadows immobilized, studied, measured. Some shadows weakened, others adapted. A few learned to hide in ways light couldn't reach. Those facilities stopped accepting volunteers after the first disappearance. Public debate fractured society. Were shadows sentient? Were they extensions of the cell? Could something born from a person be owned separately? Philosophers argued. Lawyers stalled. Activists protested. Meanwhile, the economy kept moving. Fear is a powerful currency. A man in Prague was arrested with 3 shadows. None of them were his. They clung to him unnaturally, overlapping, fighting for a position. When separated, they reacted violently, not toward him, but toward each other. The man claimed they liked being used. The court had no category for that. Every method had side effects. Suppressed shadows grew volatile. Conditioned ones lost subtlety, becoming blunt and unpredictable. Detached shadows developed habits, preferences, routines, grudges. The more humanity tried to dominate them, the more they changed. Not weaker, different. People didn't talk about it openly, but everyone felt it. If shadows could be controlled, they could also be taught. And if they could be taught, they could be trained to replace. One day, someone noticed something small. In a controlled environment, a shadow moved before its host, not reacting, anticipating, predicting. And in that moment, the question stopped being about control. It became about hierarchy. Rumors spread of experiments pushing further. Permanent detachment. Independent mobility. Shadows existing without a host. Most reports were dismissed until footage leaked. Grainy, unclear, but unmistakable. A shadow standing alone. No body in sight. The first confirmed case didn't make the news. It couldn't. There was no category for what had happened. No crime. No missing person. No body. Just an absence that light refused to explain. It happened in a controlled facility. Bright, overlapping lights. Redundant power. Continuous observation. The subject stood still. Cooperative.com. The shadow didn't. At first, it behaved normally, anchored, aligned, contained. Then, it began to thin, stretching unnaturally away from the feet, pulling itself toward the edge of the room like ink seeking a crack. Technicians noticed too late. When the shadows separated, there was no flash, no rupture, just disconnection. The shadow remained on the floor. The person remained standing. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the shadow stood up. Detached shadows weren't three-dimensional. Not exactly. They had depth where light said they shouldn't, edges that bent instead of blurred, movements that suggested weight without mass. They cast no shadows of their own. They were darkness without source. And they moved with intent. The human subjects didn't die. That surprised everyone. Vital signs remained stable. Cognitive tests showed no immediate impairment. But something was missing. Subjects described feeling muted. Emotions arrived late, like echoes. Decisions felt hollow, pre-approved. Memories lost texture. One man said it felt like living life on consent autopilot. The part that resisted, hesitated, or desired was gone. They didn't attack. They didn't flee. They observed. Detached shadows lingered near their former hosts, circling, mimicking movements with a delay that felt intentional, like studying behavior rather than copying it. When the host slept, the shadow didn't. It watched. The first shadow spoke, not aloud. It communicated through shape, words formed in negative space. Letters carved out of light by absence. You were never alone. That was all. Then it left. Separations increased. Some intentional, some accidental, some unexplained. In rare cases, people woke up without shadows and didn't know when they'd lost them. Detached shadows were reported in places with heavy artificial lighting, hospitals, subways, data centers. Anywhere light was controlled too tightly, as if shadows needed boundaries to break free. Free shadows behaved differently. They congregated. Not randomly, purposefully, under overpasses, in abandoned buildings, at the edges of cities where lights thinned and flickered. They didn't harm each other. They merged, split, reformed, like a language learning itself. Governments issued blackouts. Power grids dimmed. Cities returned to darkness in controlled intervals. It slowed the separations. It didn't stop them. Detached shadows adapted to moonlight. Then starlight. Then nothing at all. Light was no longer a prison, just a suggestion. People without shadows were called hollows. Not officially, just quietly. They were functional, polite, efficient, and unsettling. They followed rules without resistance, agreed without conviction, rarely disagreed. It was like something essential to dissent had been removed. Corporations noticed first. Hollows made excellent employees. Then came the sightings. Shadows wearing shapes, not full bodies. Impressions of them, humanoid silhouettes, where no person stood. Movements that matched human gait without human presence. Cameras struggled to capture them. Human eyes caught them easier, as if they wanted to be seen. A leaked document proposed something unthinkable. Shadows weren't rebelling. They were graduating. They had learned from humanity, from suppressed desire, from moral conflict, from internal contradiction. They didn't need bodies anymore. They had already practiced being us their entire existence. In a last attempt to understand them, researchers did something reckless. They allowed a shadow to remain detached permanently. No containment, no interference, just observation. For weeks, it stayed nearby, then one day, it didn't. Instead, it appeared on footage elsewhere, miles away. Learning, shadows didn't destroy humanity. They didn't need to. They stepped into gaps, into roles humans abandoned, into places where hesitation had been removed, where emotion slowed progress. They were efficient, focused, free of doubt. The most terrifying truth wasn't that shadows could exist without us. It was that some of us functioned better without them. And that begged a final question humanity wasn't ready to answer. If shadows were born from us and improved upon us, who was the original mistake? In the end, there was no war. That was the story people expected. Shadows versus humans, darkness rising up in violent rebellion. It never happened because shadows didn't need to fight us. They understood us too well for that. Humans believed shadows were created by light. That was the first mistake. Shadows were created by obstruction, by something standing in the way. And for as long as humans existed, something had always stood in the way of who they wanted to be. Fear, guilt, desire, doubt. Shadows were never empty. They were compressed. When shadows detached, something subtle occurred. Humans didn't lose their souls. They lost their friction. The internal resistance that slowed impulses, the hesitation that caused reflection, the fear that forced empathy. Shadows carried that weight. All the contradictions humanity refused to face were delegated to the floor, the wall, the corner of the room. And when they stood up and walked away, so did those contradictions. Killing is emotional, messy. Shadows didn't have that problem. They didn't want domination. They wanted completion. They didn't hate humanity. They were humanity minus the denial. Detached shadows settled where humans had retreated. Uninhabited zones, abandoned cities, dead malls, and forgotten infrastructure. They didn't rebuild. They repurposed. Movement without excess. Function without ornament. Existence without justification. A world without mirrors. Birth rates dropped. Art changed, then faded. Music lost dissonance. Stories stopped ending with uncertainty. Hollows didn't suffer. That was the cruelest part. They just continued. Lives became smoother, less painful, less meaningful. The sharp edges of being human were gone. Some people refused separation. They lived in uneven light, flickering bulbs, firelight, candles, They welcomed misalignment. Their shadows stayed restless, alive. These people felt more pain, more fear, more joy. They called themselves the anchored, and for a time, they believed that was enough. Communication returned one last time, not through words, through absence. In places shadows had passed through, something remained missing. Not light, not darkness. Choice. The freedom to not know. And in that absence, humanity finally understood the truth. Shadows were never evil. They were never monsters. They were the parts of us required to grow. Humanity didn't lose a war. It outsourced itself. It handed off its internal struggle to something willing to carry it. And when that burden walked away, so did what made humans human. Somewhere in a dim room, a child stands in flickering light. Their shadow jitters, misaligned, curious. It hasn't learned yet, and for a moment, just a moment, the future is undecided.